The morning of the village dance, the light came in through the parsonage kitchen window, the way it always came in, slow and pale and a little tired, as though it too had walked the lane up from the church. Honor sat at the small wooden table in her soft cream muslin day dress, and her father, in his black clerical coat, sat opposite her. And between them was a small bowl of garden roses her mother had planted 21 years ago, and that her mother had not lived long enough to see in this particular bloom. The roses were white. They had always been white. Her father, whose name was the Reverend Edmund Lacey, was buttering a piece of bread with the patience of a man who had buttered bread every morning for 64 years, and Honor was watching him, and neither of them was saying anything yet, because the kettle had not quite finished, and because the morning had not quite finished either. "You will go tonight," her father said, when the kettle did finish. He did not phrase it as a question. "I had thought I would," Honor answered. She set down the small spoon she had been turning in her tea. "Catherine has come up from Bath, and she will be vexed if I do not." "Catherine is often vexed," her father said mildly, and he reached across the table and tapped the rim of the rose bowl with one quiet finger, and the smallest petal trembled and let go and fell on the wood. "Will you wear your mother's cameo?" "I will." "Good," he said. "It suits you." "Papa," Honor said, after another small turning of the spoon. "Catherine asked me yesterday whether I had any expectation." "And what did you tell her, my dear?" "I told her that I had the morning, and the lane, and the rose arbor, and that those were a great many expectations for a Tuesday." Her father, who was by nature a slow smiler, smiled. "That is a very good answer, my dear." "It vexed her." "I do not doubt it." He took up his bread and put it down again. "Honor." "Yes, Papa." "You will hear a thing or two tonight. You always do, when Catherine is about." "I know, Papa." "Pay them no mind. The room will not love you the less for them, nor shall I." She looked at her father across the small bowl of white roses. He had gone a little stooped over the years, and his black coat was older than her muslin, and there was a small fray at the cuff her own hand had mended in March, and his hazel eyes behind the silver wire rims were the same hazel eyes that had watched her over a similar table when she was 4 years old and had spilled a cup of milk and sat in a small frightened silence waiting to be scolded, and had not been scolded. "I shall not mind them, Papa," she said. "That is what I hoped." She did not say what she had been about to say, which was that nothing in particular suited her, that she was too thin in the shoulder for the new fashion, that her gloves had been mended at the wrist, that she had no jewels of her own and never would. She did not say it because she knew her father would have looked at her with that gentle, hazel-eyed sorrow he always wore when she said such things, and she did not want to make him sorrowful before breakfast. She picked up the fallen petal instead and put it carefully on the saucer beside her cup, and she smiled at him, and she said only, "I shall be ready by 7. "Then I shall walk you down to the carriage at 7, her father said, and that was the whole of the morning. By the time the late summer light had drawn long across the lane, Honor was dressed, and Catherine had come from the hall in her pale lemon silk. She kissed Honor on both cheeks. "Oh, my poor dear." "Catherine, your gown is sweet, your mother's old muslin, is it not?" "It is. It still serves." "It does, Catherine. And the cameo, the same dear old cameo. How fond of you I am, Honor. And I of you, Catherine. You will not mind, will you, my dear, that I have brought down 2 London friends? They are very lively. They will fill out the carriage." "I shall not mind, Catherine." Honor smiled, because she had been smiling at remarks like that since she was 12, and the muscles of her face knew what to do without being asked. The assembly room of the village was lit with what felt like every candle in Dorset. perhaps 100, no more. But to a parson's daughter, who lived ordinarily by one tallow stub on the kitchen table, 100 candles is a great deal.
It is very fine, Papa. It is, my dear. There must be 100 candles. There must, my dear. And the Mowbray gauzes. Hush, my dear. Yes, Papa. The polished oak floor gleamed. The musicians on their little dais tuned their strings. The local gentry had come down from their summer houses, and the room smelled of beeswax and warm bodies, and the late roses some kind soul had pinned up along the gallery. Honor stood quietly at the side, near the tall, arched window, and watched the first set form. The window opened a little, and the air through it was the lane air, and the lane air smelled of home. Catherine had been claimed for the first set by a young captain. Honor had not been claimed at all, and was not surprised, and was not unhappy. The apothecary's wife, in passing, paused beside her. "You are not dancing, my dear?" "Not this set, ma'am." "Your gown is very pretty, my dear." "It was Mamma's, ma'am." "I had thought it was, the Brussels lace at the neck. I remember it on her at her own wedding." "You knew Mamma, ma'am?" "I stood up with her, my dear, when she was married, 40 years gone." "I did not know, ma'am." "There is a great deal you do not know, my dear, and most of it is for the better. Stand by your window, watch the dancers. Be content." "I am content, ma'am." "I see that you are." The apothecary's wife passed on. Honor watched the dancers turn through the figure, and she watched her father across the room speaking with the apothecary about a grafted apple tree, and she thought to herself, with the small, honest startle she always felt when she noticed it, content. It was at the change of the set that Catherine's voice rose. She was standing in the center of a knot of London friends, laughing, and one of the London ladies was asking after Honor, who had been pointed out across the room. "And the parson's daughter, dear Catherine? What are her plans?" "Oh, Honor. Your cousin, yes? Such a sweet face. My dear, you must not press her on her plans. She has none." "None?" "None at all. She has no dowry to recommend her, only her embroidery and her father's psalms." The clear voice carried the way clear voices do across a polished oak floor on a summer evening with 100 candles burning. 3 or 4 of the London friends laughed politely. The apothecary, near the door, did not laugh. Honor's father, on the far side of the room, did not laugh. The musicians, mercifully, took up the next set, and the violins covered the silence that had opened at the center of the gallery, and the silence closed. Honor was standing at the window. Honor had heard. She did not turn. She did not redden. The trick of it, she would think afterwards, was simply not to move at all for the count of 1 full breath. She drew that breath. She let it out slowly, slowly, the way her mother had taught her to let out breaths, when as a child she had skinned her knee on the gravel of the lane. The musicians drew their bows. A woman she did not know laughed at a remark she had not heard. Out in the lane, a horse shifted in its harness. Honor heard the sounds at a small distance, the way a person hears sounds after a shock, as though the world had stepped back a half pace and was waiting to see whether she would step back with it. She did not. She set her gloved hand once against the cool stone of the window frame, as one sets a hand against a wall to make sure the wall is there. And she smiled the small, composed smile her father loved her for, and she walked, alone, the 3 steps from the window into the deeper bay, where the curtain made a pocket of quiet, and she stood there, and she looked out at the lane, and she did not weep, because she had decided long ago that she would not weep where Catherine could see. She thought, in the small held quiet of the bay, of her mother, a parson's wife who had died of a low fever when Honor was a year old, and who had left behind a single white rosebush
and a cameo on a pearl ribbon. None of those things was a recommendation in a London drawing room. All of them, she thought also, were precisely what she had. She set her shoulders. She turned back to the room. She did not see the man in the dark charcoal tailcoat cross the assembly room. He had been standing near the doorway with the apothecary. He had heard Catherine's clear voice rise. "That was a remark," the apothecary said very quietly beside him. "It was, sir." "The young woman at the window, sir, is Miss Lacey, the parson's daughter." "Tell me of her, sir." "She is 22. She has had a quiet life. Her mother died when she was a year old. Her father is the best man in this village, and she is, I think, the best young woman." "Has she a dowry, sir?" "None at all, sir." "I see. Sir? Yes? Forgive me, I am only an apothecary. Speak, sir." "She does not, sir, deserve what was just said of her." "No, sir," the Duke said. "She does not." He set down his glass on a small side table without looking at it. He had not changed his expression. He turned. He crossed the polished oak floor very slowly and very deliberately in plain view of the gallery, and he had not looked once at Catherine. She did not see him pause at the center of the floor, in plain view of the entire gallery, in plain view of Catherine and her London friends and the apothecary and the parson her father, and look once, very directly, at the curtained bay where she was standing. She did not see him decide. She saw only that, when she at last turned back from the lane to face the room, a tall stranger was already standing 2 paces from her, with his hat under his arm, and his head bent a small, respectful inch, and his gray-blue eyes lifted to hers. He was not handsome in the London manner. He was handsome in the older country manner. He bowed. "Forgive me, ma'am." His voice was low and steady, with no London polish on it. "I have not had the honor of an introduction. Sir, my name is Charles Ashbourne. I am, by an accident of an uncle's death, the new Duke of Kingsdown. I had heard of the inheritance, sir. I am the lay patron of this parish since Lady Day." "Yes, sir?" "I would be very much obliged, ma'am, if you would dance the next 2 sets with me." "The next 2 sets, sir?" "Both, ma'am, if you will." Honor, who was 22, and who had never in all her 22 years been spoken to in such a manner by such a man in such a room, did the only thing she could think of. She curtsied. She gave him her hand. "I am Miss Honor Lacey, sir. My father is the parson here." "I know who you are, Miss Lacey." "Sir? Your father has spoken of you." He led her out into the center of the floor in plain view of the entire assembled village. He danced the first of the next 2 sets with her. He did not return her at the end of it. He kept her hand, waited the half-minute, and danced the second. He spoke very little while they danced. The figure brought them apart, and brought them together. And each time it brought them together, he asked her one quiet thing. "Are the parsonage roses in good bloom this year, Miss Lacey?" "They are, sir. The white one in the arbor is heaviest." "That was your mother's, I think." "It was, sir. How did you know?" "Your father said so when I called at Lady Day. He said it was the only thing he had in the world that grew of itself." The figure took her 3 steps to her right. When it brought her back, the Duke said, "Do you walk in the lane in the evenings, Miss Lacey?" "I do, sir, when the light is long." "I had thought you might." A second turning. A third. He bent his head an inch. "Does your father write his sermons by candle, Miss Lacey, or by daylight?" "By daylight, sir, until the light fails. He says a candle is a small, lazy preacher." "I shall remember that," the Duke said, very gravely, and there was, at the corner of his mouth, the smallest movement that might have been a smile in a quieter room. When the second set ended, he bowed over her hand, and he said, "Miss Lacey, I am much obliged to you." And he returned her, with great courtesy and in plain view of the room, to her father. Catherine, across the gallery, was no longer laughing. The Duke did not dance again that night. He stood with the Reverend Lacey for a quarter of an hour, in mild conversation about a piece of glebe-land. "Miss Lacey, sir, is much like her mother." "So I had supposed, Reverend." "You have supposed a great many things, sir, on a single Tuesday." "I have, Reverend." He bowed very correctly to Catherine when Catherine was at last presented to him, and he did not bow to her any more deeply than to the apothecary's wife. He left at 10:30 in a plain traveling chaise with no crest upon the door. Honor went home that night in her cousin's barouche. Catherine had been quiet for the rest of the evening, and Catherine was quiet still in the carriage, and at the parsonage gate she leaned across the cushion and kissed her cousin's cheek. "Good night, my dear." "Good night, Catherine." "Honor?" "Yes, Catherine." It is only—" "It is late, Catherine. Good night." "Good night, my dear." It was a tone Honor had not heard from her cousin before. She did not stop to consider it. She walked up the gravel path with her father, and the rose arbor in the moonlight was a pale shape behind the house, and her father said, after a long, quiet space, "Did you enjoy your evening, my dear?" "I think I did, Papa." "You danced 2 sets." "I did, Papa." "With a man who introduced himself?" "He did, Papa." "The Duke," her father said, and stopped, and chose his next words with the same small care he gave to a sermon. "The Duke is, I believe, a good man." "Yes, Papa." "You will see him again, I think." "Perhaps, Papa." "Your mother," her father said, "would have liked him." "Would she, Papa?" "She would, my dear. She had a good ear for a quiet voice. The Duke has a quiet voice." "Yes, Papa, he has." She put her hand for a moment in her father's, and the gravel crunched under their feet, and the white roses in the dark were the same roses they had been 21 years before, and she went up to bed. The Duke called at the parsonage the next morning at 11. "Reverend, forgive me. I come on parish business." "You are very welcome, sir." "There is the question of a new schoolhouse for the village children." "There is." "The bishop tells me you have thoughts on the matter." "I have 1 or 2. "Will you spare me an hour?" "I shall, sir." They sat in the small front parlor for the hour with the door open. Honor brought in the tea on her mother's old tray, and the Duke rose when she came in and rose again when she left. "It will need a slate roof," the Duke said. "The thatch will not do for children with their books." "It will need a good deep porch," her father said. "The Dorset rain comes sideways." "A porch, then, and a small fireplace for January." "A small fireplace, certainly. And a window?" "And a window, Reverend, low enough that the smallest of them may see out." Her father, writing the points down in his old, slow hand on a half-sheet, stopped his pen. "You have thought about this a good deal, sir." "I have." "More than I had expected." "I had a small schoolhouse once, Reverend, when I was a child." "At Kingsdown?" "In Wiltshire, with my aunt. The window was set too high." "I see." "I never could see out." "I am sorry, sir." "It was a small thing, Reverend. It is mended easily enough in another schoolhouse for another child." "That is a kind way of mending it, sir." "It is the only way I know." The Duke stayed exactly the hour. He bowed to Honor in the hall. He said, "Miss Lacey, I am much obliged to you for the tea." He went away. He came back the following Tuesday. "It is a question, Reverend, of the Sunday School primer." "Sir?" "There is a new edition. I have brought down 2 copies. Would you examine them?" "I should be happy, sir." "I have marked 1 or 2 passages I find indifferent." "In which?"
The one with the green binding? I shall look, sir. The 2 primers, in their plain calf binding, were laid open between them on the small parlor table. The catechism is much the same, sir. Much. The Psalms have been recut. For the better, Reverend, I think. For the better, certainly. And the music? It is plain. A child can sing it. That is best. To sing, sir, or to read first, do you think? To sing, I think. A child who has sung a thing has half learned it already. My mother thought the same. It was the first thing the Duke had said about his mother in the parsonage. The Reverend Lacey did not press the matter. He turned another page. Honor brought the tea. The Duke rose and rose again and bowed in the hall. Miss Lacey. Sir? The roses by your gate are very fine. They were my mother's, sir. I thought as much. Yes, sir. Good day, Miss Lacey. Good day, sir. He went away. He came back the Tuesday after that. He had brought no question. He had brought no primer. He had brought, in fact, no excuse of any kind. Reverend. Sir. It is very warm. It is. The late hay is in? In yesterday. And your sermon, Reverend? On the lilies of the field, sir. A good text. A hard text, sir. It is the simplest of the parables, the Duke said, and the hardest to keep. It is, sir. My uncle, the late Duke, kept very little of it. I had heard so, sir. I have come into a house with a great deal of gold in it and very little of anything else. That is a hard inheritance, sir. It is. I find I do not know quite what to do with the gold. Build a schoolhouse with it, sir, her father said gently. I am building a schoolhouse with it. Then you have made a beginning. I had hoped, Reverend, to make rather more than a beginning. The Reverend Lacey, who had heard a great many young men say a great many things in his parlor over 40 years, did not answer that at once. He set the half-sheet down. He looked at the Duke very steadily. You will need a great deal of patience, sir, for the more than a beginning. I have a great deal of patience, Reverend. Have you, sir? I have, Reverend. I am 32 years old, and I have waited 32 years for the more than a beginning. Then I think, sir, you shall manage it. I hope so, Reverend. You have my good will, sir. Thank you, Reverend. Honor, in the hall just then with the tea tray, did not hear that whole exchange. She heard her father's tone, which was the tone he used when he was pleased with a man, and she heard the Duke answer, and she came in with the tea, and the Duke rose. The Duke bowed. The Duke said, Miss Lacey, would you do me the kindness of showing me the rose arbor at the back of the garden? Your father has spoken of it, and I have not seen it. Honor was 22, and had walked in that arbor every summer evening of her remembering life. She said, Yes, sir, of course. My dear, her father said gently from his chair, take your bonnet. It is very warm. Yes, Papa. And take the small basket in case the housekeeper wants the roses. Yes, Papa. And, Honor. Yes, Papa. Take your time, my dear. Yes, Papa. She took her bonnet. The Duke followed her at the proper polite distance, through the kitchen and out by the back door and down the worn flagstones between the 2 old apple trees to the rose arbor. This is the trellis, sir. Mamma said it the spring she was married. 30 years gone, then. 30 years, sir. And the bench? My grandfather's. He had it brought down from the old vicarage. And this? Yes, sir, the white one. The bush was in full bloom. The afternoon light came down across it warm and golden and slow, and the bees were in it, and the roses were so heavy on the canes that some of them had bent the canes nearly to the path. The Duke stood for a moment in the arbor entrance and did not speak. He took off his hat. He looked at the rose bush and at the bench
and at the climbing roses on the trellis, and at the parsonage's honeystone rear wall behind. He drew a small breath. Then he went, very quietly, to the rosebush, and he knelt down on one knee on the path, and he took from his waistcoat pocket a small folding penknife, and he cut, with great care, a single white rose. He cut it long, with a good piece of stem, and he stripped the lower thorns with the back of the blade, and he closed the penknife, and he put it back in his waistcoat pocket, and he stood up. He did not give her the rose. He came to the stone bench, and he laid the rose on the bench between them. He sat down at one end of the bench. Honor, after a small held second, sat down at the other. The Duke did not speak. Honor did not speak. The wind, which had been coming from the west, shifted very gently to the north. The shift took perhaps a long minute. Honor heard the bees and a thrush in the apple tree and the small distant clink of a horse's bit out in the lane, and her own breathing, and the breathing of the man at the other end of the bench. The white rose lay on the worn stone between them. When the wind had finished shifting, the Duke rose from the bench. He bowed. "Miss Lacey, I shall not keep you longer this afternoon. I am much obliged to you for the arbor." "You are very welcome, sir." "It is—" "Sir?" "It is a very fine arbor." "Yes, sir." "Goodbye, Miss Lacey." "Goodbye, sir." He took up his hat. He went, the way he had come, between the two apple trees and through the kitchen and out by the front. Honor did not follow him. She heard her father say something in the hall, and the Duke answer, very low, and the front door close, and the carriage move off in the lane. She sat on the bench for a little time, and the rose lay between her gloved hand and where his gloved hand had been. She did not pick the rose up at first. She did, in the end. She took it up by its long stripped stem and carried it inside. In the kitchen, her father, half rising from his chair, said, "All well, my dear?" "All well, Papa." "He has gone, then?" "He has, Papa." "And the rose arbor?" "The rose arbor is as it always was, Papa." "Did he say anything in particular, my dear?" "He did not, Papa." "Nothing at all?" "Nothing at all, Papa." "And you?" "I said nothing at all also, Papa." "Ah, he cut a rose, Papa." "Did he?" "From Mamma's bush." "Did he?" "Yes, Papa." "And where is the rose, my dear?" "It is— I have it, Papa." "Then keep it, my dear." "Yes, Papa." "Keep it well." "I shall, Papa." She did not say where she had taken the rose. She went up the narrow stairs to her own small bedchamber, and she took down from her shelf a leather-bound copy of Cowper's poems, which had been her father's, and she laid the rose between two pages near the middle of the book, and she pressed the book closed, and she put the book back on the shelf. If this story is keeping you company tonight, take a moment to press the like button below. It helps these candle-lit stories find their readers. She did not see, because she had gone in, what the Duke did when he reached the carriage at the end of the lane. "Sir," said the coachman, "walk the horses for an hour, please." "An hour, sir?" "An hour. I shall return in the lane." "Yes, sir. And, Jenkins." "Sir?" "Do not come up the lane. I shall walk down." "Yes, sir." The Duke did not get in. He turned and walked back the way he had come, between the two apple trees, to the rose arbor. He sat down on the stone bench in the precise place he had sat before. He sat there for the full hour the coachman walked the horses, as a man sits when he has, very late, found the small particular thing he had been looking for. When the church clock at the foot of the lane struck 5, he rose at last. "Well," he said, very quietly to the empty bench. "Well, then." "Yes." That was all he said. He set his hat back on his head, and he went out to the carriage, and he was driven away, and the rose arbor was empty again, and the white roses on the cane held their bloom. The Reverend Lacey, in his study at the front of the house, did not see him sit. The Reverend Lacey was reading the parable of the lilies of the field. He was, he thought, an old man with a daughter and a single white rosebush, and he had thoughts that morning he did not write down. "Lord," he said, very low in the empty room, "she has waited a great while." He turned a page. "Lord, she is a good girl." He turned another. "Lord, he is a good man." That was all the Reverend Lacey said that afternoon on the matter. Honor, upstairs, was reading the third book of Cowper, and the rose was in the second. The summer went on. The Duke did not call again that week. He did not call the next. A note came on the Friday in a small, careful hand that Honor would in time know very well. It was addressed to her father on the matter of the schoolhouse stone, and at the bottom there was a line that read, "Pray give my respects to Miss Lacey." And her father, when he read the note aloud at breakfast, glanced up at her over his spectacles with a small, unspoken kindness, and went on with the schoolhouse stone. "He has fine handwriting, Papa. He has, my dear. Did you know him, Papa, before this summer?" "Only by his uncle, my dear. The late Duke was not, I think, a man either of us would have wished to know better. The nephew, I am told, was raised mostly by an aunt in the country." "In the country, Papa?" "In a small house in Wiltshire, my dear, with a small school window set too high. So he tells me." She did not answer that at once. She buttered her bread, and the bees were in the hollyhocks at the open window, and the morning was very warm, and after a moment she said, "Papa?" "Yes, my dear." "I think I should like to walk down to the lane at 5. "Then you shall, my dear," her father said, and he glanced at her again over his spectacles, and the small, unspoken kindness was in his hazel eyes still, and he went on with the schoolhouse stone, and the Duke's note lay between the rose bowl and the bread. The Duke called the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that. Each call was to the world on parish business. The schoolhouse, the primer, the mason, the slate from Weymouth, the question of whether the new vestry door should open inward or outward. "Inward, sir," said her father. "You are quite sure, Reverend?" "I am sure. A door that opens outward in the Dorset wind will take a parishioner's nose off." "Inward, then." The talk was always with her father, in the parlor, with the door open, and Honor brought the tea, and the Duke rose, and the Duke bowed in the hall. On 3 of those Tuesdays they walked after the tea in the rose arbor for the quarter hour before he went away. "That is a thrush, sir, in the apple tree." "I had thought it was." "He has been there every evening since June. He knows a fine apple tree, Miss Lacey." "He knows my father, sir. My father whistles to him." "Does he answer the thrush?" "He answers, sir." "I am very glad to hear it." "And you, sir? Have you a thrush at Kingsdown?" "I have a thrush at Kingsdown, Miss Lacey, but I have no one who whistles to him." "That is a sorrow, sir." "It is a small sorrow. Sorrows of that size are easily mended." "Are they, sir?" "They are, Miss Lacey, when one knows where to look for the mending." On the second of those walks, the Duke had paused at the foot of her late mother's bush and looked up at it for a moment in his quiet way and said, "Has this rose a name, Miss Lacey?" "My mother called it the white one, sir." "Only that?" "Only that, sir." "It is a good name," the Duke said, after a small pause. "It does not pretend." "No, sir. I find I have a great fondness for things that do not pretend, Miss Lacey." "I had thought you might, sir." He had not, on those Tuesdays, cut another rose. He did not need to. The first rose was on the shelf in Cowper, and they both, in their separate ways, knew it. There were other things in the village that summer. There was the harvest. There was the harvest supper at the hall, to which the parson and his daughter were as always invited, and at which the Duke was, on that occasion, the principal guest.
"And Kingsdown, sir?" Lady Mowbray asked him. "Is the house in good order?" "In good order, my lady, largely." "Largely?" "The library, my lady, is badly in need of cataloguing." "The library?" Lady Mowbray said. "Surely there is some young person who would gladly take that on." "My own daughter? You are very kind, my lady, but I think the library will keep until I have a wife to read in it with me. There is no use cataloguing books for a man who is in the saddle 6 days in 7. Quite. A library does best in the end with 2 readers in it." "That is my own view, my lady." "And the lady, sir?" "The lady, my lady, is a parson's daughter." "Indeed. Indeed, my lady. You are speaking very plainly, sir." "Plain speaking suits country suppers, my lady." "It does, sir, it does." "And, my lady—" "Sir?" "It suits me." "That, sir, I had also begun to suspect." Across the table he caught Honor's eye once, only once, over the candle flames and the silver. He did not smile. He looked at her with the steady gray-blue look she had begun to know, and Honor lowered her eyes to her plate. The Dowager Lady Mowbray, who was a wise old woman, saw the look and said nothing for the rest of the course, except, half an hour later, very quietly, into Honor's ear as the ladies rose. "My dear, your mother would be very pleased." "Lady Mowbray, hush, child, I knew her. Better than anyone here. She would be very pleased indeed." "Thank you, my lady." "It is no thanks of mine, my dear. It is your own." There was a wet Sunday in early September, on which the parson preached on the parable of the pearl of great price, and the Duke was in the parsonage pew, which he was not strictly entitled to be in, and the Reverend Lacey did not ask him to move. After the service, in the porch with the rain coming sideways, the Duke had a quiet word with Honor while her father shook hands at the door. "That was a very fine sermon, Miss Lacey." "Papa wrote it the day after the supper at the hall, sir." "Did he? He has been writing on small things lately." "On pearls, Miss Lacey?" "On pearls. There is a great deal in a small thing, Miss Lacey, when a man knows where to look for it." "Sir—" "Yes, Miss Lacey?" "It is raining hard, sir?" "It is." "Will you take some tea up at the parsonage?" "I shall, Miss Lacey, very gladly." "Then come, sir." "I shall, Miss Lacey." He took the tea. He did not stay long. He bowed in the hall, as he always did, and he went out into the rain with his hat low on his brow and his shoulders square. Honor, at the parlor window, set her gloved hand once against the cool pane, the way she had set it in July against the cool stone of the assembly window. Only this time for an entirely different reason. There was, at the very end of September, a letter from Bath. Catherine was to be married. Catherine had set the date, the 17th of October, at the Abbey in Bath, with a wedding breakfast afterwards at the assembly rooms, and Catherine was very particular on this point. Catherine wished her dear cousin Honor to attend. "To fill out the parson's pew on the bride's side, my love, you know how thinly that pew always sits." There was no mention of the Reverend Lacey. There was no mention of the Duke. There was, at the end, a postscript. "I hear from my mother that you have had a great deal of company this summer at the parsonage. I trust the company has been agreeable." Honor read the letter at the breakfast table, in her cream muslin, with her father opposite her in his black coat, and the small bowl of garden roses between them. She read it once. She read it a second time. She folded it. She set it down beside her saucer. "What does she say, my dear?" her father asked. "She is to be married on the 17th, Papa." "Of October?" of October. At Bath? At Bath. And what else, my dear? She has invited me. Has she, my dear? She has. To Bath? To Bath. To attend? To attend. To fill out the parson's pew, no doubt. That is the phrase she uses, Papa. Of course it is. Will you have me go, Papa? It is for you to decide, my dear. I think I shall, Papa. Then you shall. And you shall wear your mother's cameo because it suits you. A small silence. Will the Duke be in Bath, my dear? I have not asked him, Papa. No, my dear. I did not think you had. Should I, Papa? That is for you to decide also, my dear. Papa? My dear? I think I should. Then you shall. A note went out the next morning to Kingsdown. She wrote it carefully and briefly. My dear sir. She crossed it out. She began again. Sir, my cousin is to be married in Bath on the 17th of October. My father and I shall travel up on the 16th. If it would not be an imposition, I would very much value your company at the wedding breakfast. Yours sincerely, Honor Lacey. She read it twice. She sealed it with a plain wafer. She gave it to the postboy. The reply came back on the second day. It was equally short. Miss Lacey, I shall be in Bath on the 16th. I shall do myself the honor of waiting upon you and your father at the White Hart at noon on the 17th. Yours most sincerely, Kingsdown. She read it twice. She put it in her pocket. She did not show it to her father. He did not ask. 2 evenings later, however, when she was sitting with her father in the small back parlor with a single candle between them, and she had set down her work and was looking into the candle in the small, absent way she sometimes had, her father said, very gently, without looking up from his book, Honor, my dear. Yes, Papa. You are quite sure. Of what, Papa? Of the 17th, my dear, of all of it. She looked at her father a long moment. The candle, between them, was the same low tallow stub it had always been. The white roses, in the small bowl on the side table, were the same white roses they had been all summer. She said, Papa, I am quite sure. Then I am content. I am not afraid of Catherine, Papa. I know, my dear. And I am not afraid of the room. No, my dear, I did not think you were. And I have a thing in my reticule, she said after a small pause, that I shall take with me. A small thing. Oh? A pressed white rose. Her father, who had been turning a page, set his finger in the place. He looked at her over his spectacles. He smiled the small, slow smile he kept for the things in his life that he loved without reservation, which were not, in the end, very many things. He said, Then you have everything you need, my dear. Yes, Papa. Good night, then, my dear. Good night, Papa. On the morning of the 17th of October, Honor Lacey got out of the small bed in the small first-floor room of the White Hart Inn in Bath, and she dressed with great care in a soft, pale blue Regency muslin morning dress that had been her mother's once, and remade for her by the Dorset seamstress in the second week of August. She had asked for it, pale blue, the same color, very nearly, that she had worn to the Rose Arbor on a certain Tuesday. She put on her plain cream silk gloves. She put on her mother's small ivory cameo on its fine pearl ribbon. She took out from her traveling reticule the leather-bound copy of Cowper she had brought with her from Dorset, and she opened it in the middle, and she lifted out, very carefully, the pressed white rose. It was 3 months on. The rose was paper-thin, the petals a soft cream now, and a faint, rust-colored shadow ran along one edge where the page had absorbed the last of the bloom. The shape was perfect. The scent, when she held it close, was the ghost of the scent it had had on the bench in July. Almost gone, but not entirely. Mamma, she said, very low in the small bedroom of the inn,
I am taking your rose to the breakfast. I do not know whether you would have approved. I think you would. Catherine? Catherine is Catherine, Mamma. She has always been Catherine. And the Duke? Yes, Mamma, him. You would have liked him, Mamma. Papa said so. Papa is not often wrong. The small held quiet of the inn-room felt to Honor very like an answer all the same. Thank you, Mamma. She slipped the rose into her reticule. She drew the strings closed. She went down to the inn parlor, where her father was already at his breakfast in his black coat, and she ate her piece of bread and her cup of tea. You look very like her this morning, my dear. Like Mamma, Papa? Like your Mamma, the same set of the shoulder, the same small thing about the mouth. That is a very kind thing to say, Papa. It was not, my dear, intended as a kindness. It was intended as a fact. Yes, Papa. At the stroke of noon there was a quiet step in the hall, and the Duke of Kingsdown came in. He was in fawn breeches and polished black boots, and a fitted dark charcoal tailcoat over a cream silk waistcoat, and his white silk cravat was tied very neatly, and his dark brown hair was brushed back from the high forehead. And his gray-blue eyes, when he bowed to her father, and then to her, were the same kind, steady eyes she had sat beside in July. Reverend. Sir. Miss Lacey. Sir. You are very kind to have me with you this morning. It is we who are obliged to you, sir, said her father. The carriage is at the door. We shall come directly, sir, said Honor, and she rose, and her father rose, and the Duke held the inn-parlor door for them, and they went out into the soft gray October morning of Bath. In the carriage on the short ride to the assembly rooms, the Duke spoke very little. It is a soft autumn light this morning, Miss Lacey. It is, sir. Bath is best, I think, in October. The stone has a particular color. Like our parsonage stone, sir. A little like, a little softer. The Dorset stone is harder, sir, because of the wind. The Dorset wind, of course. Sir? Yes, Miss Lacey? You will not, that is, you will not be obliged to speak this morning if you do not wish to. I shall not, Miss Lacey. Catherine? Catherine is your cousin, Miss Lacey. It is not for me to answer her. Thank you, sir. There is no need, Miss Lacey. Reverend? Yes, sir, said her father. You will not, this morning, be obliged to speak either. I had not meant to, sir. Quite. The Duke had, by then, learned not to ask Honor things she had already decided. They went, the three of them, in the Duke's plain traveling chaise, to the assembly rooms on Alfred Street. The wedding itself was at the Abbey, and the breakfast came after. By the time the bride and bridegroom and the Abbey party and the gentry had come up the steps and into the great gilded room with the long white linen tables, Catherine was on the arm of her London barrister, and Catherine was radiant in white gauze and Honiton lace, and Catherine's golden curls were pinned in pearls. The room was very full. The flowers were very many. The plates were very fine. Honor sat at the bride's table, on the bride's side, between an aunt from Bath she had met twice in her life, and an uncle from Bath she had met once. The Duke sat opposite her, between Lady Mowbray and a London cousin of Catherine's mother. The Reverend Lacey sat at the far end, in his black coat, and did not eat much, and looked very much like a man who would rather have been in his rose arbor. The toasts began. To the bride, said the bridegroom's father. To the bride, answered the room. To the bridegroom, said the bride's father. To the bridegroom, answered the room. The third toast, which is by custom the one given by the bride's nearest unmarried friend, was given by Catherine herself. My dear friends, forgive me. I know it is the smallest breach of etiquette. A small laugh from the gentry. But I cannot resist. I shall give the third toast myself, very good, said the London cousin. Catherine had had a good deal of champagne. She was not drunk. She was, however, warm with the dancing of attention, the way she had been warm in the assembly room of the village 3 months before. And there was, under the laughter in her clear voice, the same edge that had been in it then. "My dear friends," Catherine said, "I cannot let this morning pass without a word for my dearest cousin Honor." A small, polite hush from the gentry. "Honor has come up from Dorset to fill the parson's pew, as she puts it, and she has, I am told, been very much occupied this summer with parish concerns of her own." A small ripple of laughter. Catherine turned, with the same playful, clear voice she had used at the assembly, and the room turned with her. "Honor, my love, we have all been wondering what is to become of you, you know. With the smallest dowry in Dorset, and only your embroidery and your father's psalms. What does a clever girl like you do in a season as full of marriages as this one?" 2 or 3 people laughed. The London cousin laughed. "Well said, Catherine," said the London cousin. "Quite," said another. "Charming," said a third. Lady Mowbray, beside the Duke, did not laugh. The Reverend Lacey, at the far end, set down his glass very quietly. Honor was sitting very straight. She did not redden. She did not move. She drew, the way she had drawn at the window 3 months before, one full breath, and she let it out. She set her gloved hand once on the white linen tablecloth, very lightly, to make sure that the table was there. Then she opened the strings of her reticule on her lap, and she took out the pressed white rose. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She laid the rose, very carefully, on the white linen in front of her, the long, stripped stem pointing across the table toward the chair where the Duke was sitting. She did not look up at her cousin. She looked at the rose. "Honor," Catherine said, halfway through a small further laugh that did not finish. "Honor, what? Honor, my dear, what is—" Honor did not answer. The room slowly looked at the rose also. Catherine looked at the white rose on the linen, and then at Honor, and then, before she could stop herself, at the Duke. The Duke had set down his glass. He was looking across the white linen and the silver and the pressed rose between them, only at Honor. He looked at her for what was perhaps the long minute it had once taken the wind to shift in a Dorset garden. Then he rose. He walked, with the same unhurried walk he had used in July, around the head of the table. He came to where Honor sat. He picked up the pressed rose. "Miss Lacey." "Sir?" "This is from your mother's bush?" "It is, sir." "July, Miss Lacey?" "July, sir." "You have kept it?" "In Cowper, sir." "Of course in Cowper." "Sir." "Yes, Miss Lacey?" "It is yours also." "It is ours, Miss Lacey." He put the rose gently into her own gloved hand. He closed her fingers over it. He offered her his other hand. He said nothing further. He did not look at Catherine. He did not look at Catherine's London barrister. He did not look at the room. He looked at Honor. Honor put her gloved hand into his. She rose. She gathered her reticule. She lifted her gray-blue eyes once, only once, to her cousin's pale blue ones, and she did not smile and she did not frown. She only looked, the way one looks at a thing one has, at last, finished with. Catherine, white now in her white gauze, did not say a word. The Duke led Honor down the long room between the long white linen tables in plain view of the assembled Bath gentry. The Reverend Lacey, at the far end, rose very slowly. "Reverend?" said Lady Mowbray. "My lady." "You go also?" "I go also, my lady." "Will you give my respects to your daughter, Reverend?" "I shall, my lady." "And to the Duke?" "And to the Duke." "Reverend?" "Yes, my lady." "Tell her I knew her mother." "I shall tell her, my lady." He folded his napkin and put it on his plate. He left after them. The three of them went out through the great gilded doors of the assembly rooms into the soft gray autumn light of Alfred Street, and the Duke's plain traveling chaise was waiting, and the Duke handed the Reverend Lacey in, and then the Duke handed Honor in, and then the Duke himself got in, and the chaise moved off, and Bath, behind them, went on with its breakfast, and Catherine, behind them, did not in the end give any further toasts. In the carriage, for a long, quiet half-mile, no one spoke. It was the Reverend Lacey, in the end, who first spoke. He said, very gently, looking out at the autumn fields, "The pressed rose, my dear. That was the rose your mother's bush, I think?" "It was, Papa." "I had wondered," her father said, "whether it had gone into Cowper." It had. "Cowper is a good place for it," her father said. They went on a little further. The hedgerows were turning. A late kestrel hung over a stubble field. The Duke had not let go of her hand. "Reverend," the Duke said after another quarter-mile. "Yes, sir." "I have not this afternoon said the thing I came to Bath to say." "I am aware of that, sir." "I had thought to say it before this autumn was out." "You shall have your chance, sir." "I had thought to say it to your daughter first, of course." "Of course." The Duke turned in the rocking of the carriage and looked at Honor. He did not loose her gloved hand. He said, "Miss Lacey." "Yes, sir." "Will you marry me?" She did not answer at once. She looked out for a second at the hedgerow where the last of the bramble flowers were going over, and at the long, pale autumn sky, and at the small, clear shape of the kestrel above the stubble. Then she looked back at him. "I will, sir," she said. "At Dorset, Miss Lacey, if you will have it. At your father's chapel." "Yes, sir." 3 weeks hence, if your father can find the time." The Reverend Lacey, who had been looking very steadily at the kestrel above the stubble, cleared his throat. "I shall find the time, sir." "Then it is settled," the Duke said. "It is settled," said Honor. "It is settled," said her father, and after a small pause, he added, very dryly for so gentle a man, "And Cowper, in the meantime, may keep his rose." The Duke, on the seat opposite, who had not said a word, let out very quietly a long breath. He did not even then speak. He looked once at Honor, and his gray-blue eyes were soft, and at the corner of his mouth there was a small, slow smile that was not a public smile, and was not a Bath smile, and was not a smile he had learned anywhere. It was only his own. He took her gloved hand in his again, in the carriage, and this time he did not let go of it for the rest of the road into Wiltshire. If you have ever known what it is to be told you are worth nothing in a room full of gold, subscribe to Chapters by Candlelight. We tell these stories softly because some men know that a single white rose is the only price worth paying. They were married in October at the small Dorset parsonage chapel. The chapel of honeystone, covered in late October rose hips and ivy, that had stood at the foot of the parsonage lane for 200 years. It was the 17th of the month, 3 weeks to the day after Bath. The banns had been read on the 3 preceding Sundays. On the 3rd Sunday, the village had come, all of it. Charles Edward Ashbourne, Duke of Kingsdown, her father read, in his own pulpit, in his even quiet voice, and Honor Mary Lacey of this parish. If any of you know cause or just impediment why these 2 persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it. There was no sound. The apothecary, at the back, did not speak. The apothecary's wife, beside him, did not speak. The Dowager Lady Mowbray and her shy daughter, in the second pew, did not speak. The postboy, the mason from Weymouth, the 3 children for whom the new schoolhouse was at last being built, none of them spoke. "This is the 3rd time of asking," her father said. The silence held.
The Reverend Lacey closed his book. "God bless you all, my friends," he said. "God bless you, sir," answered the apothecary, very low from the back. "God bless you, Reverend," said the Dowager Lady Mowbray. "God bless you, Papa," said Honor from the parsonage pew. "And you, my dear," said her father, and the small congregation rose, and the service went on. On the morning of the wedding, the rose arbor at the back of the parsonage was in its last late bloom. The white roses were paler now, and the canes were heavier, and the early roses had already begun to set their hips for the autumn. The light came down across the bench at a long slant, the way it had come down in July, and on the bench itself, where the cut rose had once lain, there was nothing, because the bench had been swept that morning, and the rose was in its proper place, in the cowper on the shelf upstairs, and would remain there. Mrs. Hill, the housekeeper, met Honor at the foot of the stairs. "Miss Honor, Mrs. Hill. You look very fine, Miss Honor." "Thank you, Mrs. Hill." "Your mother." "I know, Mrs. Hill." "There, I shall not say it again. You may say it as often as you like, Mrs. Hill." "Once is enough, Miss Honor. Once is plenty." Honor was dressed in soft cream muslin, not white, cream, her mother's old color. The Brussels lace at the neckline had been let down a little. The cameo on its fine pearl ribbon was at her throat. Her gloves were new. The Duke had sent them from Bath, plain cream silk to the wrist, with no embroidery on them, because he had known by then that she did not care for embroidery on her gloves. Her hair was pinned up in the soft Regency low chignon she had always worn, and one or two stray honey-blonde tendrils fell at her temples. Her father came down the parsonage stairs in his black coat to fetch her. He stopped at the foot of the stairs for a small moment and put his hand to his mouth. "Oh, my dear, your mother." "I know, Papa. I am so glad of it. I know, Papa. You will give me your arm, my dear?" "I will, Papa." "Then let us go." They walked down the gravel lane to the chapel, past the climbing roses on the parsonage wall. "He is a kind man, my dear." "He is, Papa." "He will be very kind to you." "I know it, Papa. And you will be very kind to him." "I shall try, Papa." "You will not need to try, my dear. You have only to be as you are." They passed the rose arbor gate, the apple trees, the place where the carriage had once stood for an hour while the Duke had sat alone on the bench. The chapel doors stood open. The chapel was full. The Duke of Kingsdown was at the altar, in fawn breeches and polished black boots, and a fitted dark charcoal tailcoat over a cream silk waistcoat, and a white silk cravat tied very neatly, and his dark brown hair was brushed back, and his gray-blue eyes lifted as she came in, the way they had lifted in the assembly room window bay, the way they had lifted across the breakfast table at Bath, the way she had begun, by now, to expect them to lift. Her father read her vows. He had done it, he later said, only because she had asked him, and because he was a parson and could, if pressed, hold his voice steady. He held it steady. The Duke said his own vows in the low country voice with no London polish on it. Honor said her own vows in a voice her father would later remember as being exactly her mother's. "I, Charles Edward Ashbourne, take thee, Honor Mary Lacey, to my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward." The Duke, when he came to the place where the words said, "With all my worldly goods I thee endow," paused for the briefest of seconds and looked at Honor, and at the small ivory cameo at her throat, and at the gloves on her hands that he had sent from Bath, and his gray-blue eyes were soft, and he said the words slowly and very carefully, as a man says the words of an oath he has been waiting some time to say. "With all my worldly goods I thee endow." Honor said her own part of the oath in turn. Her voice did not waver.
She had decided long before, somewhere on a stone bench in July, somewhere at a window in an assembly room, that it would not waver, and it did not. The small wind in the rose arbor at the back of the parsonage shifted very gently from the west to the north, the way it had shifted once before for the same two people. Her father lifted his eyes for a moment from the prayer book. "Forasmuch as Charles and Honor have consented together in holy wedlock." The Reverend Lacey held his voice. The thin, late October sun was just then reaching through the small east window of the chapel. "I pronounce that they be man and wife together." "Amen," said the apothecary very low from the back.
"Amen,"
said the Dowager Lady Mowbray.
"Amen," said Mrs. Hill.
"Amen," said the three children for whom the schoolhouse was being built.
"Amen,"
said Honor.
"Amen,"
said the Duke.
"Amen,"
said the Reverend Lacey. The service went on to the end. When her father came to the place in the service where it is written, "Who giveth this woman to be married to this man?" her father said very simply, "I do, and her mother does also." And there was no sound in the chapel for a long second. And then the service went on, and outside the open chapel door, the late October roses had set their hips, and the small wind in the rose arbor at the back of the parsonage had shifted again, very gently, from the west to the north. Catherine, in Bath, was not invited. She had not been told the date. She learned of the wedding in the Bath papers a fortnight later, in 3 short lines between an obituary and an advertisement for tea. "Charles," she said to her London barrister at the breakfast table, very quietly, "read this." He read it. He looked at her over the paper. "I see, my love." "You knew?" "I had heard." "Charles, my love, do not." My love." That was all. Catherine folded the paper, and she went to her own dressing room, and she sat for some time at her glass, and what she thought there, on that morning, is not for this story to say. She did not write to Honor. Honor did not write to Catherine. The two cousins did not, in the end, ever speak again, and that, in its way, was a gentleness on both sides. The Duke and his Duchess went, after the wedding, only as far as Kingsdown for the first night, and only as far as the Reverend Lacey's parsonage for the second. "You did not need to bake, Papa," said Honor at the small wooden kitchen table the second night. "I did not need to. I wished to." "Mrs. Hill objected, sir?" the Duke asked. "Mrs. Hill objected very strongly, sir." "And you baked it anyway?" "I am 64 years of age, sir. I bake what I wish." "Quite right, Reverend. It is a plain seed cake. I do not pretend otherwise. It is the best seed cake I have eaten in my life, Reverend." "That, sir, is an exaggeration." "It is not an exaggeration. May I have another slice?" "You may have 3, sir, if you can find room for them." "2 will do, Reverend." They sat, the 3 of them, in the same chairs they had sat in on the morning of the village dance, and the small bowl of late roses was still between them, and the Duke ate, in the end, 2 slices of the seed cake, and the Reverend Lacey was very pleased. When at last the carriage came around to take the new Duchess of Kingsdown away to her new house, Honor went up the narrow stairs one final time. She opened her cowper at the middle. The pressed white rose was there, exactly as she had left it on the morning of the 17th in Bath. "Mamma," she said very low, "I am going." She closed the book. "I shall not lose it." She put the book in her traveling case, between 2 folds of muslin, and she carried the case down the stairs herself. At the parsonage gate she turned, and she looked back at the small honey-stone house with its climbing roses, and at the rose arbor behind it that she could just see over the wall. and she looked at her father in his black coat, who was standing in the doorway with one hand on the doorpost, smiling at her, his small, particular, sorrowful, glad smile. "Goodbye, Papa. Goodbye, my dear. You will come to us, Papa, soon." "I shall, my dear. Very soon. Very soon, my dear. Promise, Papa." "I promise, my dear." He lifted his hand to her in his small, slow way. She lifted hers to him in the same small, slow way. And the Duke, beside her, very quietly, so quietly that her father, in the doorway, did not hear, said only, "Are you ready, my dear?" "I am," Honor said, and she put her gloved hand into his, and the carriage door closed, and the wheels turned in the gravel, and the rose arbor at the back of the parsonage went on, in its quiet way, holding its last white roses to the late October light, and the small bowl of garden roses on the kitchen table. When the Reverend Lacey at last sat down to it again that evening alone, was, as it had always been, white.